The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Tiger takes a tumble. The debate over opening schools grows more heated than ever, and the new president has some splaining to do about putting kids in cages, just like Trump. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm Tim Donner, senior political analyst for LibertyNation.com, and we'll take you around the horn this week from a crash that has laid low one of the greatest athletes in American history to the latest on the pandemic, vaccines, school openings, the stimulus still being debated. Plus, we'll try to answer the question of how, with Donald Trump now gone, the left will fill its hate vacuum. And we'll go back in time 100 years with author David Pietrusza to discover the remarkable similarities between 1920 and 2020. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza examines threats and promising developments regarding your individual liberty in Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. The nation was shocked this week when Tiger Woods, a legend well beyond the golf course where he may already be the greatest of all time, was roughed up badly in a single-car crash in a posh neighborhood 30 miles south of L.A., suffering multiple fractures to his right leg, requiring a rod and screws and pins to be inserted in his leg and foot and ankle, which are, of course, central to his livelihood. After years of dominance of his sport, all-time greatness, followed by ugly revelations about his extramarital affairs, Tiger was awarded the Medal of Freedom by then-President Trump in 2019, 10 years after the dark stories came out.
A true legend, an extraordinary athlete who has transformed golf and achieved new levels of dominance. He's also a great person. He's a great guy. Tiger introduced countless new people to the sport of golf from every background and from every walk of life. He inspired millions of young Americans with his thrilling wire-to-wire victories. Tiger Woods is a global symbol of American excellence, devotion, and drive.
Of course, the first question after his accident was whether Tiger Woods was drunk, but the sheriff in charge said he was not. In terms of whether he'll ever be able to play golf again, let's just say if it was anyone other than Tiger Woods, no chance. But with him, who knows? Meanwhile, COVID-19 remains an ongoing health threat despite falling caseloads in 90% of the country and more than 2 million people a day getting the vaccine, with a big dump of new vaccine supply expected early in March. But a couple of issues surrounding the pandemic have become political hot potatoes. First, schools, so many of which remain closed to in-person learning thanks to pressure from teachers' unions. And House Minority Whip Steve Scalise said on ABC's This Week that the same Democrats who spoke constantly about following the science in the Trump era are doing the reverse.
There's so much science out there that says that this is hurting kids, millions of kids in America right now that are not getting in-classroom learning every day. And again, you look at CDC guidance, you can look at the American Academy of Pediatrics. They all lay out how you can safely reopen schools. About 40% of children in America today are learning in school, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Those are in hot spots and places where the virus is not as serious. But if you look at what the priority should be, it should be the children. And that's not the case, because right now you can see as the unions have stepped up and said that they don't want in-classroom learning, you've seen the White House pressure the CDC to reverse guidance, which was very clear.
It certainly doesn't help that the media is ginning up high levels of fear about the pandemic. The man who conservatives trusted the most on Trump's COVID advisory team, Dr. Scott Atlas, said the health and media elite keep bombarding us with the same discredited information and baseless predictions about variances in the virus.
There's not only no accountability, there's a repetition of stuff as if it were never proven wrong. I mean, we're seeing it with the schools. When you look at the American media in particular, where people keep stressing what we don't know, what might happen, and we know so much about the variants, there's no evidence that there's some kind of massive spike due to these variants. There's no evidence that there's increased lethality. But we have American stories. If you look at the data from the National Bureau of Economic Research, over 90% of American stories negative and therefore fear-invoking, whereas in Europe, just over 50%.
And what exactly would you expect from a media which served as a bullhorn for the leftist message that Trump was to blame for all of those who died in the pandemic? The same media now towing the line in support of every decision on COVID made by the new administration. And for those of you who've been vaccinated and think that means Liberation Day has arrived, the omnipresent Dr. Fauci says, think again.
There are certain aspects of being vaccinated and what that means to you personally and your own personal safety and that of your family versus what vaccines will allow you to do in society. One relates to you yourself being vaccinated, and the other relates to the number of people and the relative percentage of people in society that will be vaccinated, because there will be things that you will not be able to do because the burden of virus in society will be very high. Indoor dining, theaters, places where people congregate. That's because of the safety of society.
Indeed, we are not out of the woods quite yet. One revealing barometer will be what Major League Baseball decides about crowds when their new season starts in early April. Then there's the matter of the stimulus package for the victims of the COVID shutdown. How much is enough? Well, the Republican who despised Trump and was loved for it by the media and is now presented as a true bipartisan kind of guy, Mitt Romney, said, with Democrats in control of Congress, the GOP, even him, doesn't even have a say in the matter. And listen to his glowing introduction.
One of the things we need more than ever is to find some common ground. And if there's somebody who's trying to find common ground in Washington, it is Senator Romney, somebody who has tried to cross the aisle many a time.
The Democratic leadership has determined that they want to push through the plan without any changes to it whatsoever, and without any input from Republicans. And because it'll be done through budget reconciliation, they don't need any of our votes. We indicated also we're happy to compromise, to meet in the middle, to work together. But the administration had no interest really in pursuing that path. And the Democratic leadership in the Senate and the House has not picked up that path either. There's a lot of stuff in there that's just simply wasteful. And I wish we could use the money that we're going to go out and borrow from China to actually do things that'll make a difference.
Hard to argue with that. And the Biden administration is running into problems in a couple of other areas, like the southern border, where this president is putting kids in cages just like Trump did. And White House Press Secretary Jan Psaki was confronted about it by the increasingly aggressive Peter Doocy of Fox News.
Why is the Biden administration reopening a temporary facility for migrant children in Texas? It's the same facility that was open for a month in the Trump administration, summer 2019. That is when Joe Biden said, under Trump, there have been horrifying scenes at the border of kids being kept in cages. And Kamala Harris said, basically, babies in cages is a human rights abuse being committed by the United States government. So how is this any different than that?
We very much feel that way. One, there's a pandemic going on. This is not kids being kept in cages. This is kids. This is a facility that was opened that's going to follow the same standards as other HHS facilities. That is never our intention of replicating the immigration policies of the past administration.
Oh, heaven forbid. But that's exactly what they've done, just like Obama did before Trump. But of course, we never heard about that in 8 years of Obama and heard about it constantly under Trump. Then there's the matter of the Biden team trying to take credit for things Trump accomplished. Associated Press reporter Matt Lee confronted State Department spokesman Ned Price about turning Trump's work in bringing businesses back from overseas into their own achievement.
It's a bit disingenuous to claim credit for the 18 companies winding down. All of this work was done under the previous administration. Matt, you guys have only been in only been in office for a month, right? Are you telling me that in the last 4 weeks, these 18 companies all of a sudden decided to say, "Oh my God, we better not do anything with Nord Stream 2"?
I am speaking for the
all of that. You guys are taking credit for stuff that the previous administration did. Right?
I am not.
No?
I am
Yes or
speaking
no?
for the Department of State.
Okay.
Again, folks, that's not a Fox News reporter. That's a reporter for the most mainstream of all news operations, the Associated Press. We'll break away briefly, then come back and try to answer the question, after Trump, how will leftists fill their hate vacuum?
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, liberty.
Today.
All the time and everywhere.
With LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis.
You're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts. And dozens of insightful original articles. And now, you can keep your kids ahead of the curve with LNGenZ.com. LN Gen Z brings a free-thinking education right into your home for students of every grade level with articles, videos, worksheets, and ready-to-go curricula. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. Liberty Nation and LNGenZ.com.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So here's a question for you. After Donald Trump, how will leftists fill their hate vacuum? Because the left has long made sport of depicting Republicans as not just wrong, but evil. Indeed, it's a long and venerable tradition among those on the left side of the political spectrum, or at least they treat it as such, hating on whatever Republican makes it to the top of the political food chain. In fact, it's become so common and so egregious in the case of Donald Trump that we take progressives radiating hate for granted. And we thus become prone to forget that the Trump derangement that they display is simply the latest and most odious iteration of a decades-long tradition of leftist vilification of Republican presidents. Take us back about 50 years to Richard Tricky Dick Nixon, who was, to the left, the devil incarnate, dripping with evil. They succeeded, the left did, in forcing him to resign, but 6 years later, after the docile presidency of Jimmy, I will never lie to you, Carter, Ronald Reagan showed up and was openly depicted by the left and their supplicants in the media as a racist at home and warmonger abroad. But that project proved difficult because of Reagan's enduring personal popularity. The left took a brief hate respite with Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush. But then along comes the dastardly duo of George W. Bush and, gasp, Dick Cheney. We knew from the start that Bush would be depicted as a dolt, a know-nothing Texas hayseed, somehow born as the unworthy scion of a family of wealth, privilege, and power. Lest we forget, following the Trump era, the attacks on Bush 43 were vicious, scurrilous, and unrelenting. Unlike Trump, Bush refused to respond in kind, and his approval numbers were successfully driven into the toilet by the time he left office and yielded to Barack Obama. As much as George W. Bush was reviled by his enemies on the left, it was almost impossible to believe that the left could adopt a hatred of even greater magnitude while that 43rd President W. was holding down the Oval Office. But they did, and in Richard Bruce Cheney, they saw the embodiment of every dark and sinister force on the planet. He was the evil mastermind, pulling the puppet strings on Bush, the unwitting stooge. The mere mention of the name Cheney would send leftists screaming from the room in uncontrolled rage. Of course, all of that was just a dress rehearsal for the main event. Nixon, Reagan, Bush 43, and Cheney rolled into one neat, oh-so-hateable bundle named Trump. Leftists rode the wave of their media wing and perfected their scorched earth schemes to the point that a majority of Americans believed in the run-up to the 2020 election that the 45th president is a racist. Never mind his unprecedented outreach to black voters. Never mind a record low black unemployment. None of that matters. No wonder he lost. The left will continue their demonization of Trump for a while, but as time marches on and we come to expect this current president to stop blaming Trump for everything wrong in the world and put some actual points on the scoreboard for the American people, who will the leftists direct their fire at now? With no Trump to kick around, who will progressives target and demonize as the latest embodiment of conservative evil? Who will fill the left's hate vacuum? And that takes us to the heart of the matter. Leftists need to not just disagree, but vilify conservatives is an admission that they cannot win on the strength of their own ideas and have been reduced to the assertion of raw power. They have sought not to debate, but to end debate. So who's next in the left's hate parade? Ron DeSantis, Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, someone else who dares to carry forward the MAGA America First message? We're not yet sure who it might be, but rest assured that with Trump disappearing slowly into the rearview mirror, the left's hate vacuum will soon be filled afresh. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss the latest iteration of the old expression, there's nothing new under the sun. 2020 and 1920. A lot more similar than you might imagine.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now for the latest installment of Nothing New Under the Sun, designed for those of you who believe the politics and culture of the current day are so wrong or depraved that this must be the worst condition the country's been in, like, forever, or at least since the Civil War, right? bitter political divisions, mob violence, censorship, a deadly pandemic. Well, guess what? All of this has happened before, 100 years ago. In his new book, 1920, The Year of the Six Presidents, historian and prolific author David Pietrusza explores the differences and surprising similarities between 2020 and 1920, as he explained in a discussion with LibertyNation.com editor-in-chief Lisa K. Donner. And as he surveys the culture of a century ago, he puts to rest the notion that the America First movement was started by Donald Trump, or even, as many historians have wrongly stated, by Charles Lindbergh in the run-up to World War II.
What changes from decade to decade and generation to generation is, I think, what sins are popular and what sins are unforgivable. So we do bad things at some point, and then we straighten up in others. And we also get very scrupulous about things. Right now, we're in a great scrupulosity about race and ethnicity and all this. But you know, the issues which were in 1920 were our involvement in the world. Are we going to go it alone, or are we going to be America first? That phrase does not go back to the interventionist argument before World War II. It goes back to World War I. You know, it's been around a long time. That was a Harding slogan. He made a phonograph record of one of his speeches called America First. You can listen to it today. So you're talking about that. The Ku Klux Klan is getting up and running at that point. Integration. It's also a time when blacks are voting Republican, when Woodrow Wilson has segregated the District of Columbia, the federal workforce, and now we're legalizing all sorts of substances. And in 1920, we were delegalizing alcoholic beverages. Well, we weren't actually. That's one of the things which is misunderstood. You could have booze and you could drink booze. There was nothing illegal about that. You just couldn't manufacture it or transport it.
And of course, we're seeing a similar debate over marijuana and other drugs today, forgetting that we tried prohibition of widely popular intoxicants 100 years ago, and the project was such an abject failure that the 18th Amendment banning the sale of liquor in 1919 was reversed just 14 years later in 1933 by the 21st Amendment, canceling the prohibition. But as per the title of the book, half a dozen once or future presidents were all mixing it up around the presidential race of 1920, plus one subversive outsider, making it all sound something like 2020.
In 1920, like, one of the key things is it's the year of the six presidents. And to back up, they are, because they're all in play in one way or another, T.R. Harding, Coolidge, Franklin Roosevelt, who's running for vice president that year, and Herbert Hoover. So they're all involved in one way or another, but there's a semi-major party candidate because he's going to get nearly a million votes when there were a lot less people back then. And he's Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate. So he's running from Atlanta Penitentiary. And they let him, basically. I mean, they don't let him out, but they let him send out, little 500-word attacks on American capitalism and society and the major parties. After 1917, sedition. We talk about sedition. And so we have an Espionage Act and we have a Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act is used against opponents of our entry into World War I, who in many cases were socialists, were left-wingers, were pacifists, and they are packed off to jail. Now, what we have today is where you may be shut down on Twitter or Facebook, etc. Back then, the United States government would be more direct. and the United States government could shut you down from the mail. Right. And so magazines would be banned from the United States mail. And that is how they would shut people down when they were not outright arresting them. And then, of course, you might have occasional mob violence. There's the Centralia massacre after World War I, where some veterans and some IWW, International Workers of the World, radicals, mix it up. And there's a horrendous lynching which occurs of one of the radicals. The Wilson cabinet, is discussing, should we be throwing Theodore Roosevelt in jail because he keeps criticizing us? Okay, how dare he? But it's like, well, no, he's Theodore Roosevelt. I don't think we should do this. It's like, as I say, things were in many cases different then, even though you may have cases of mob violence and repression, which exist, again, not unprecedented.
And Mr. Pietrusza goes on to discuss how the progressive movement we see today actually had its roots in the early 20th century and took on a form that was in many ways similar to today.
You've got the progressive era, which has started 15, 20 years before 1920. And it gets up and rolling with the muckrakers. And, progressivism doesn't start out of nowhere, out of the ether. So there's a populist movement before that, which kind of meant something a little different than the populism of today. But that gives way. So progressivism, there's like these three branches of left-wing, shall we call it, reform, but I'd prefer to call it just change or agitation. And progressivism, which is kind of middle class and in the cities, populism, which is often in the prairies or the South. And that's another thing to think about, is we think about who's going to be on which side of a political spectrum. And so the real racism often comes out of populism in the South or the progressives. Theodore Roosevelt does not allow blacks to be delegates to his Progressive Party convention in 1916, although they had been for years and years and years to Republican political conventions. And then the third thing is outright socialism, which is not yet communism, because there isn't any real communism until 1920 or 1917 when the Bolsheviks take over Russia. But you've got all those three strains. They're often working for the same goals. And then you have the Republicans or even the Democrats. There's a big strand of conservative Democrats going into like the New Deal then. But the conservative, shall we say, reaction in the 1920 election, the reaction from this rising tide of Theodore Roosevelt progressivism really takes hold with the nomination of Warren, Gamaliel Harding, and Calvin Coolidge, two of the most conservative presidents we've ever had in the history of this republic.
And lest you think the phenomenon which more than anything else marked the Donald Trump era of American politics, the history of media bias, fake news, and powerful publishers pushing a point of view, well, it goes back a lot further than Trump or Bush or Reagan.
Back in olden days of the 1900s, you would have papers which were outright either Democrat or Republican. And so William Randolph Hearst, while he becomes conservative in the 1930s and from then on, in the teens or the aughts even, he's Mr. Radical. He's a dangerous, radical left-wing guy. And he sort of starts to shift because he's not gung-ho for war in 1917. Oh, Theodore Roosevelt hates him because of that. But he shifts over, but Warren Harding, who we mentioned earlier, was a newspaper editor. I think he was head of the Republican Newspaper Editors of Ohio, if one can imagine such a organization today. And who does he run against? He runs against James Middleton Cox, who ran the Democratic paper in Dayton, Ohio. And so you would see this, over and over again. Today, we still have the Gannett chain, USA Today. Back in the 1930s, Frank Gannett was going to be the vice presidential running mate if William Borah got the nomination in 1936. So this goes on for a very long time.
Did you hear that? Both nominees for the presidency in 1920 were newspaper editors. Imagine if the editor of the New York Times or Washington Post actually ran for president and made it. But of course, they've decided to settle for simply bending the news in the direction they prefer. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, liberty.
Today.
All the time and everywhere.
With LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis.
You're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts. And dozens of insightful original articles. And now, you can keep your kids ahead of the curve with LNGenZ.com. LN Gen Z brings a free-thinking education right into your home for students of every grade level with articles, videos, worksheets, and ready-to-go curricula. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. Liberty Nation and LNGenZ.com.
And now we have reached the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitle Talkin' Liberty, as we welcome back in our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and the man that we prefer to call our guardian of individual liberty, Scott David Cosenza.
Save the best for last. Thank you so much.
Best for last.
Yes.
I could have just skipped the other parts of the...
No. Please don't do that.
No, you don't want me to skip the other part of the credentials. All right, I promise I won't. But you wrote a lot on this week on LibertyNation.com about election laws and cases before the Supreme Court and how critical Justice Clarence Thomas was of the court's intransigence in terms of accepting cases on election law as they declined to hear election cases.
Well, he wrote beautifully, Tim, this week, as he often does. Justice Thomas wrote in dissent from his colleague's decision not to hear any of the cases that involved election officials or courts in the various states that changed election laws before the November elections. We had numerous instances where, whether it was judges of elections or the heads of state boards of elections or state Supreme Courts, in other cases, changed election laws. That could be the length of time that an application had to be mailed in from when it was cast for an absentee ballot, or rules about standing in line for polls. All sorts of little things that concern election law. And the Constitution says that the various state legislatures shall be in charge of the manner of all the various elections that take place to elect our federal candidates. Remember, we don't have one election, for instance, for president. We've got 50 elections for president, right?
Right.
So these were all challenges that were brought in on an emergency basis, commensurate with the November election. And the Supreme Court basically sat on those cases and didn't do anything and didn't indicate they would do anything on them. We've been waiting to understand whether they would accept them. In other words, accept them to be ruled on, argued and ruled on. Or what has happened, which is they said they will refuse to rule on them. And that's created, Tim, a split in the circuits that's just going to exist. It's kind of fascinating. One of the main ways that cases get to the Supreme Court is that the Supreme Court hates, and the legal system hates, when there are two separate rules for different Americans, which is what we have now. In the Third Circuit, which is where Pennsylvania sits, where a number of these cases came, the rule right now is that the Pennsylvania Secretary of State or the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is allowed to make changes to election rules. That's what the Supreme Court has kind of indicated by their not taking the case, or at least they're allowing to happen. But yet at the same time, where Michigan sits, I think it's the, I won't even say I speculate, I forget what circuit it is, but in that circuit, Tim, there is a rule now where that's not the case, that because of the federal circuit court rulings in that area, we now have a situation where there, only the legislature can make those rules, which, by the way, is what is commensurate with what most sort of like pro-liberty activists would have the rule be, which is to say that the Constitution says it's for legislators to judge, and it's not for every and any person who kind of can put their thumb on whether it's Republican or Democrat. And so that's what we were hoping we would get a bright line ruling out of the Supreme Court. And they have said, Tim, that basically it's a moot issue because whether they would make, no matter how they would rule, would not result in a change to the published election results from November. On Justice Thomas's point, where he lays out in beautiful detail, really, why it's important for the court to take this case, and what it will do is, by not taking the case, is just present this for future elections, which are already kind of upon us, with people declaring in primaries before the congressional elections at the national level.
The plain language of the Constitution, this is not hidden in emanations and penumbras from some Supreme Court decision. The plain language of the Constitution says that it is state legislatures that determine the voting laws for each individual state. So that's the plain language. So if you've got state Supreme Courts and you've got federal courts changing election laws as they did this time, isn't it incumbent upon the Supreme Court to, whether it changes the outcome or not is no longer relevant, Joe Biden is president, isn't it incumbent upon them to do what they're really chartered to do in the Constitution, which is to clarify the law when there's a conflict between what the Constitution says and individual states are doing?
That's your view, Tim. Justice Thomas shares it. The other justices don't agree. You know, we don't know why they disagree. I'm sort of the cynical side that says they refuse to take it because it would look bad against on sort of the actions of Democrat state officials. But, you know, it's one thing is for sure, Tim. The counter argument that some of these officials should be able to make some changes, even in a pandemic, for instance, that's a defensible position, but it should be made in court, and the Supreme Court should rule on it. Yeah. That's the only thing that Justice Thomas argues with a passion here. It's not, he hasn't described the case's result and what it should be. He just presents really in a way that I think compels a response from the other side in terms of, you know, how he's laid out, how it's so vital that we have trust in our process, and, you know, that this case is ripe for judgment. You know, there's
absolutely
some of them. Probably the most famous case that could have been mooted out was Roe v. Wade. If you think about it, and not to be, the gestation time for a human being is less than the gestation time for a Supreme Court case. And so you could have a situation where they could just refuse to ever rule on an abortion question, for instance, if they were willing to do that. And Justice Thomas, in his writings, Tim, goes on to talk about the crunch of time, what happens around an election and election litigation. And now is the time when they can breathe around an idea and have it briefed, not on an emergency basis.
Right.
And
exactly.
with the full kind of sobriety of analysis that's affordable, not during this kind of the crunch of an election that they should be analyzing it. And it's presented there for them right on the plate. You know, it's a case in controversy. There is a split in the circuits. It's a vital issue. Why are we not describing it? He says he's befuddled and baffled by his brother and sister justices' decision to not take this case.
Okay, thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
Scott D. Cosenza, legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com. This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we will be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.